The wind howled low across the prairie, dragging shadows like torn fabric across the dust. Eliza Crane pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the threadbare wool held little warmth. It was late October, and the land seemed to brace itself, trees clutching the last of their leaves, animals moving quieter, quicker, as if they too sensed something coming. Her horse shifted beneath her, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of coming snow, and Eliza scanned the horizon with eyes that had learned not to hope. She buried her father 2 weeks prior under a thin layer of stony soil near a place called Ash Ridge. He died like he lived, sudden and without ceremony, heart giving out somewhere between the well and the barn. It was just the two of them after Kansas took her mother in the Great Fever, and she'd grown up filling the space grief left behind with work, mending harnesses, trading eggs for coffee, keeping her father's cough in check with boiled sage and whispered prayers. But when he collapsed, she hadn't cried. She just dragged him home and sat beside him until morning broke cold over his still chest. Now she rode west, away from the empty homestead and the ache it housed. The last words he ever said to her were, "You ain't meant to stay small in one place forever." She didn't know if he meant it kindly or as some final release. Either way, she took it like a sign. 2 days into her journey, Eliza came across the cabin. It was tucked beneath a stand of pines, low-slung and gray with age. Smoke curled from the chimney, faint and unhurried. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the reins. Her supplies were dwindling, just a crust of cornbread wrapped in cloth, a dented canteen, and a worn Bible with pages like onion skin. Still, she knew better than to trust too quickly. But the horse made the decision for her, sidling up the rutted path and snorting as if in approval. By the time she reached the porch, dusk had folded over the woods like a blanket. She knocked twice with her knuckles, firm but not frantic. The door opened slow, revealing a man. He wasn't what she expected, no grizzled trapper or toothless outlaw. He stood tall, broad-shouldered but lean, like someone used to building fences more than breaking bones. His hair was dark, curling a little at the neck, and his eyes were the color of riverbed silt, gray but not cold. "You lost?" he asked, voice even not unkind. "No," Eliza said, though she wasn't sure it was true. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind that measured rather than judged. Then he stepped back. "I got stew on the fire. You're welcome to warm yourself." She entered without a word of thanks. Her gratitude was tangled up in suspicion, a knot she'd learned to keep tight. The cabin was small but clean. A wood stove glowed in the corner, casting a flickering amber light over a table, 2 chairs, and a bed piled with patchwork quilts. She hovered near the door, watching him ladle stew into a tin bowl. He set it on the table and pushed a spoon toward her. "Name, Jonah." "Eliza." "You riding through or staying a while?" "Don't know yet." He nodded like that made perfect sense. They ate in silence. The stew was thin but hot, the kind that tasted better the hungrier you were. Eliza kept her eyes on the spoon, though she felt his gaze every so often, not intrusive, just curious. When the bowl was empty, he offered her a place by the fire. She didn't decline. As the flames danced in the stove, she studied his hands. Scarred but steady, like he'd done hard things but never quick or cruel. He didn't ask about her father or why she traveled alone with winter close at her heels. She liked that about him. That night she slept on a bedroll near the hearth while he kept to his own bed. Neither of them said good night. They just let the quiet settle over them like frost. In the morning, he handed her a tin cup of coffee and said, "Storm's common. You'd be smarter to wait it out here." Eliza took the cup, sipped slow, and nodded once. She stayed. And in the days that followed, chopping wood, boiling potatoes, patching leaks in the roof, she learned how easily survival made strangers into something else. Not friends, not yet, but something quieter, steadier. Something that felt like a beginning, even if she didn't trust it. Even if it terrified her more than the cold. Snow came sudden, heavy and wet, bending pine limbs low like mourners at a grave. It blanketed the world in a hush that made every sound, an axe splitting wood, boots crunching against frost, echo louder than it should. Eliza stayed on in Jonah's cabin not because she wanted to, but because the storm left her no choice. By the third day, the trail out had vanished beneath drifts waist deep. Jonah didn't say it, but she could see in his measured movements that he'd known this would happen. He kept a rhythm to things, chores in the morning, repairs by midday, quiet suppers with little talk and long silences. He didn't try to fill the stillness, and that made it easier for Eliza to exist inside it. She took over the hearth, kept stew pots full, stitched worn gloves and patched blankets. Not out of affection, but out of habit, out of the way need made people useful to one another. Still, there was something strange about living beside a man who did not once ask her what she was running from. One night they sat at the table eating bread she'd managed to coax from a stubborn lump of flour and salt. A candle flickered between them. Jonah chewed slow, eyes on his plate. "You bake like someone who don't like to waste," he said. Eliza glanced up, caught the shadow of a grin at the corner of his mouth. "I was raised not to," she replied. "Who taught you?" "My mother before she passed." He nodded. "Mine too," said waste was pride in disguise. She let the silence stretch between them again. It had a shape now, the way snowdrifts have curves, not empty, just full of things that didn't need speaking. Later, she found herself watching him more. The way he rolled his sleeves to his elbows when he worked, how his hands moved with care even when he was mending something no one else would bother saving. There was no swagger in him, no boast, just the kind of patience that spoke of long winters and long waits. One morning she caught him outside chopping wood with his jaw clenched against the cold. She brought him coffee without thinking, and he took it without a word, just a slow nod of thanks. Steam rose between them, mingled in the air. "Why are you out here?" she asked, voice low. Jonah took a breath like he was weighing something. "Had a brother once. We homesteaded out by the Clearwater Fork. Things went bad. He left. I stayed." Eliza didn't ask more, didn't need to. He added after a while, "Wasn't the land that got hard. It was the being alone." That stayed with her. That, and the way he looked away when he said it, like the words cost him something. As the snow deepened, so did the routines. She'd wake early to the sound of him moving about, boots scuffing, stove crackling. He'd leave coffee beside her roll before stepping out into the gray hush. Sometimes he'd bring back rabbits, sometimes only silence. And when he returned empty-handed, she never asked why. Not every wound bled where you could see it. One afternoon, she found a drawer half full of papers, drawings, nothing fancy, charcoal sketches of the landscape, deer caught mid-leap, a crow perched on a split-rail fence. They were good, better than she expected. Alive. She left them untouched, but something in her shifted. A man who drew birds had once loved softness, or longed for it. That night they sat in quiet again, a shared rhythm in the clink of spoons and the crackle of fire. "You miss him, your brother?" she asked. Jonah's eyes stayed on the flame. "I miss who we were, before it all got too heavy." Eliza knew the weight he meant. She carried her own like a stone in her belly. The days passed like this, close but careful, and it was not love, not yet. It was hunger, not for touch, but for nearness, for a voice that stayed through the night, for hands that did not take, only offered. She thought once that love was a luxury, a soft thing for people with softer lives. But here, in this cabin where the wind bit hard and days asked more than they gave, Jonah made her wonder. If maybe love wasn't softness at all. Maybe it was survival, a fire built from small kindnesses, a cup of coffee left steaming, a silence that didn't ask questions, only kept you company. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start again. By the second week, the snow had hardened to a crust that cracked underfoot, and the trees wore their frost like lace. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, filled with the smell of burning pine and the slow-cooked sweetness of dried apples she'd rehydrated in a pot. Eliza had found a rhythm, not comfortable exactly, but steady, a pace where the days no longer felt like borrowed time. Jonah kept his habits, rising early, moving with purpose, but she'd begun to notice the small ways he shifted around her. He'd wait for her to finish her stitching before chopping wood, set a second spoon beside the bowl without asking. There was a kind of quiet knowing in the way he made space for her without laying claim to her presence. He did not crowd her grief. He just let it exist like weather. One morning, she rose to find him gone. No note, no tracks beyond the yard, just the echo of the door shutting behind him hours earlier. Her first feeling was not fear, but a sharp pang of something worse. The hollow space he left behind was louder than she expected. She busied herself, sweeping the hearth, rewrapping the preserves, checking the traps along the ridge trail. He returned near dusk, his coat dusted white, and a dark smear above his brow. A deep gash cut through the skin just below his hairline, and he limped as he stepped over the threshold. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to him before she could think better of it. Tree gave way, snapped under the ice. He swayed slightly, and she caught his arm, guiding him to the chair without permission or protest. Blood trickled down his temple. She tore strips from an old petticoat and cleaned the wound, hands steady though her chest thudded like hooves against packed earth. "You should have waited till the thaw. I needed to check the far traps, food's thinning." "You're not a mule," she snapped, sharper than she meant. Jonah looked at her then, really looked. "Didn't know you worried." "I didn't say I did," she muttered, knotting the cloth tighter than necessary. But something shifted in the air between them, not soft, but raw, like a nerve exposed. That night she moved slower through the cabin, drawn toward the silence that had settled into him like cold in old wood. He sat by the fire, head bowed, fingers loose around a cup he didn't drink from. She watched him for a long time before finally asking, "Was it always like this for you, living alone out here?" He shook his head. "No, for a while there was someone." She didn't press. "She left," he added, quiet. "Said the land would take me before love ever could." Eliza felt the words settle like weight in her chest. She stared at the flame. Maybe she just wanted to be chosen. Jonah turned to her then, and the look in his eyes wasn't pain exactly. It was something older, regret worn thin with time. "Maybe I didn't know how to choose back then." They left it there, let the silence cover the raw edges like snow over a broken trail. But that night, when she curled beneath her quilt, she didn't feel alone. The next few days brought a thaw, slow and reluctant. Water trickled under ice, and the trees began to shed their frost like old skin. Eliza and Jonah worked side by side without needing to speak. She cleaned the coop out back. He reinforced the roof where snow had pressed the beams to a groan. In the afternoon light, he caught her humming as she hung herbs near the window, something old from her mother's tongue. She hadn't meant to sing, hadn't realized it was still somewhere inside her. He paused in the doorway, arms dusted with sawdust. "That's a comfortin' sound." She looked down, embarrassed. "Didn't think I remembered it." "Maybe it remembered you." There it was again, that gentleness, the kind that didn't ask to be noticed. And it caught her off guard, the way her breath caught sometimes when she stepped outside and the air was clearer than it should be. A sudden ache for something she'd never had but always wanted. That night she took out the Bible, not to read it but to hold it. It had belonged to her mother, and the margins were filled with tiny notes in a handwriting she barely remembered. She didn't pray, just ran her fingers over the ink, remembering how it felt to be looked at like someone worth saving. Jonah noticed, but he didn't speak. Instead, he pulled a scrap of charcoal from the drawer and began to draw again. She leaned over, curious, and saw a line forming, a face, not detailed but unmistakably hers. The curve of her jaw, the fall of her hair. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. But that night she left her bedroll by the hearth and lay down on the floor nearer to his bed. Just near, not touching. A shared warmth across the narrow space. Neither of them spoke, but she heard his breath change, slower, softer. In the dark, the silence between them felt different now. Not empty, not anymore. Spring arrived not with a grand thaw but in murmurs, the drip of meltwater down the cabin's eaves, the soft groan of earth waking beneath the snow. Shoots of green threaded their way through the frost-hardened ground, cautious and trembling. Eliza walked barefoot on the first day the sun warmed the porch, just to remember the feeling of earth under skin. Jonah watched her from the steps, a cup of coffee in hand, quiet as ever. They built something, though no words marked its shape. The line between survival and something softer had begun to blur, but neither of them reached to name it. Some things, Eliza had come to understand, grew better without being spoken of. Jonah started working on a linta near the woodpile, saying the old shed wouldn't last another winter. Eliza joined him most afternoons, holding nails, sawing lengths of pine, her arms stronger now than they'd been in the fall. He let her work without fuss, only correcting her grip with a gentle touch when needed. His hands never lingered, but she felt the echo of them long after. One day, while he hammered a beam into place, she asked, "What would you've done if I hadn't knocked?" He paused, leaned back on his heels. "Lived, I guess, same way I was." That enough for you?" He didn't answer right away, set the hammer down, wiped his brow. "Was," he said at last, "then winter passed." Eliza felt the truth of it settle deep, like water finally soaking into roots long dry. That night they sat at the table, her sewing a rip in his shirt, him whittling a spoon from cedar. The fire crackled low, the cabin filled with the scent of wood and worn cotton. "You ever want more?" she asked without looking up. He stopped carving, considered. "More what?" "Than this, than quiet, than making it day to day." He exhaled slow. "Used to think I didn't deserve more, lost too much, made too many mistakes." Eliza's fingers stilled on the fabric. "We all lost things." He looked up then, eyes meeting hers across the flicker of firelight. "What did you lose, Eliza?" She held the shirt in her lap, thread dangling like a tether. "My family, my land, the part of me that thought needing someone was weakness." Jonah's jaw tensed, then eased. "It ain't." She shook her head. "It's dangerous. Folks leave or die. Loving makes you soft. And softness," she trailed off, swallowing the rest. He stood then, walked over, and crouched before her, close but not touching. "Softness ain't the same as weak," he said. "Takes more strength to stay open than to shut down." Her eyes brimmed, unbidden. She looked away. He reached out slow and took the shirt from her lap. Not her hand, not her body, just the shirt. A gesture that said, "I see you, but I won't take more than you give." That night they didn't move closer, but sleep came easier, and when she dreamed, it was of warmth, not fear. By mid-April, the trails had opened. Mud sucked at boots, birds called low from the trees, and the cabin no longer felt like a shelter from death, but a place that held life again. Jonah cleared a patch of soil behind the cabin for a garden. Eliza planted herbs she remembered from her mother's apron pockets: rosemary, sage, a few onion bulbs she'd bartered for years ago and never used. Her hands moved with memory, digging, pressing, patting the earth like it might forgive her for surviving when others hadn't. One afternoon, they took the horse out for wood. She rode behind him, arms around his waist more from necessity than want, or so she told herself. The woods smelled of thaw and cedar, and for a moment she let her cheek rest against his back. He said nothing, just placed his hand briefly over hers on the saddle horn, a touch that held steadiness, not claim. When they returned, she made cornbread, not because he asked, but because he liked it with honey, and she'd found a small jar tucked away in the loft. They ate in the soft light of dusk, and afterward he cleaned the dishes while she leaned against the doorframe, watching the sun slip down. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. "Used to," she said. "Thought I had to keep moving or grief would catch me." "And now?" She turned to him. "Now I think I stopped just in time." He nodded, then stepped closer, slow like approaching a skittish colt. His hand brushed hers, and when she didn't pull away, he held it fully. "Eliza," he said, voice low, "I ain't asking for promises. I know the cost. I just want to stay in the same place as you if you'll have me here." It wasn't a declaration, it was an offering. And that, more than any vow, reached her. She squeezed his hand, gentle, then stay. It was not love, not yet. But it was something that could hold through another winter. And perhaps one day even more. Summer came quiet, not with a blaze but with a slow lengthening of days and the low hum of bees drifting between wildflowers. The woods grew thick with green, and the creek behind the cabin ran faster now, carving new shapes into the stone. Eliza took to washing clothes in its shallows, her skirts gathered at the knee, arms brown from sun and labor. Jonah carved fence posts most mornings, shirt off in the heat, sweat running down his spine like rain on bark. They moved together now without needing to speak, passing tools, sharing bread, glancing up at the same moment to find the other already watching. There were still silences, but they were warm ones, filled with breath and birdsong and the sound of something slowly, quietly growing. One evening, Eliza sat out on the porch, mending a satchel she hadn't touched in months. Jonah came up from the tree line with a rabbit over his shoulder, cheeks flushed from the chase. He paused when he saw her. "You fixin' to leave." She didn't look up, just patchin' what needs patchin'. He stepped onto the porch and sat on the top step, close enough that she could hear his breath catch and steady. "I still don't know much about you." There's not much worth knowin'. That's a lie, he said softly, but I won't press. Just, he leaned forward, elbows on knees. Sometimes I wonder what you'd say if I asked you to stay for good. She set the satchel down, the needle still threaded, hanging like a question. I don't have much to offer, she said. Just a name, a past full of loss, and hands that know work better than touch. Jonah turned toward her. You got steadiness, fire when it's needed, and you stayed when you didn't have to. That's more than most. She felt his words in her chest, like warmth after a chill that's lasted too long. Later, as dusk slipped into dark, they shared bread and smoked meat, sitting side by side. The quiet between them held a weight that was no longer wary. It was full of what had passed and what hadn't yet been spoken. When thunder rolled low over the hills that night, Eliza woke with a start. Storms had always unsettled her, something old and buried coming to the surface with every flash of light. She sat upright, breath quick. The rain came hard, drumming the roof like a warning. Jonah was already awake. He crossed the floor and sat beside her bedroll, not touching but close. You all right? She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. He didn't speak again, just waited, and slowly her breath eased. You know, she said quietly, when I was little, I used to think storms were proof that God was angry, that if the thunder got loud enough, it meant someone done something terrible. Jonah glanced toward the window. I always thought it was just the land remindin' us it could speak louder than we could. They sat like that for a long time, the storm raging, the cabin small but steady. After a while he reached out, not to pull her close, but to take her hand where it rested on her knee. She let him. Not because she needed comfort, but because she wanted to feel him steady beside her when the world outside seemed to roar. In the weeks that followed, they prepared for the coming autumn. The garden yielded onions, squash, a few sad tomatoes. Eliza began storing them in jars, labeling them in her mother's hand just to remember what it felt like to belong to someone. Jonah worked long into the evenings, finishing the shed, replacing warped boards on the cabin wall. Sometimes she'd sit and read aloud to him from the old Bible, skipping the verses that spoke of wrath and choosing instead the ones about refuge, about rest. One day she caught her reflection in the creek and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her shoulders were stronger, her skin lined by sun, and her eyes, those she knew. They were still watchful, still wary. But no longer hollow. She stood, letting the water drip from her arms, and turned back toward the cabin. Toward the man who'd waited each day, without reaching too far. Toward a life that didn't ask her to forget the past, only to carry it beside someone willing to share the weight. Jonah met her in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. You all right? He asked. She looked up at him, then past him to the little table they shared, the quilts they'd patched, the quiet proof of two people choosing not to run. I think, she said, I'm learning how to be. And for once, the words didn't feel like a lie. Autumn came slow, the way a fire burns down to coals, steadily, surely, without needing to declare itself. The trees blazed gold and red across the ridge, and the air took on a sharpened edge. Wood smoke lingered in the mornings, and the hush of evening came sooner with each passing day. Eliza found herself waking before the first light now, slipping out of bed without a sound to gather herbs or stoke the stove. Jonah would rise not long after, wordless but present, the two of them moving in tandem like roots entwined beneath frostbitten soil. There was still no talk of love, no need. What they had was built in the way they endured beside one another, a quiet fortress made from habit and intention. She didn't mark the moment she stopped thinking of the cabin as his and started thinking of it as theirs. One afternoon, as they gathered the last of the onions, Jonah found a worn scrap of lace caught in the coop fence, part of an old curtain Eliza had used for patchwork. He held it up, brow raised. You hangin' laundry on the hens. She smirked, brushing dirt from her hands. Maybe I wanted them to feel fancy. Reckon they'll start layin' gold eggs any day now. His smile lingered longer than usual. She caught herself watching the lines that had softened in his face since last winter. Lines not from worry, but from sun and laughter, from mornings warmed by 2 cups instead of 1. By late October, Jonah had started sleeping with one arm stretched toward her bedroll, not quite touching but near enough to feel her there. She began curling closer in kind, until one night, without plan or fuss, she slipped beneath his quilt as though she'd always belonged there. No ceremony, no words, just the way some rivers eventually bend to meet. In the quiet before dawn, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I never wanted to need anyone again," he whispered. She nodded against his breath. "Me neither." "And now?" She traced the curve of his jaw, rough with stubble. "Now I think needin' ain't weakness, it's what keeps us warm." He kissed her then, not like a fire but like an ember, something meant to last. The days shortened and the work thickened. Eliza learned how to smoke meat, how to listen for the warning signs in the sky. Jonah taught her how to track deer by the pattern of broken twigs and how to read a storm by the bend of treetops. She showed him how to stitch without puckering the fabric and how to press wildflowers between pages of old books so they'd last through the winter. They argued sometimes, sharp as flint but never to wound. He forgot to latch the coop. She oversalted the stew. There were slammed pans and silent afternoons, but always a return. Always two bodies returning to the table, to the fire, to the small, hard work of choosing each other again. One night she found him at the edge of the ridge, watching the stars. He didn't turn when she stepped beside him. "I used to come here when I was angry," he said. "At God, at the land, at myself." She folded her arms, the cold nipping at her sleeves. "You still angry?" "Not like I was, still grieve though, that doesn't go." "No," she said, "it doesn't." He turned to her, "But it don't mean we stop." "No," she echoed and reached for his hand. "It don't." The first snow came late, soft and powdery, blanketing the cabin in a hush that was no longer lonesome. Eliza sat by the window, watching it fall, a quilt across her lap and Jonah behind her, his hand resting at the base of her spine. She didn't think of the road anymore, or the past, or the pain that had once made her believe love was for other people, people without scars, without ghosts. Now she understood. Love wasn't what made you weak, it was what made you willing to stay, to trust, to build again on splintered ground. Jonah kissed her shoulder, and she turned to him with a softness she never thought she'd carry again. "Think we'll make it through another winter?" he asked. "We already have," she said, because she knew now that survival wasn't just food and fire. It was two hands reaching for the same kind of peace. It was coffee waiting in the morning. It was a porch with two chairs, one always waiting. It was the quiet between them, steady as breath. Love, she realized, wasn't luxury at all. It was what saved her. And it would every day again.